By December 1942, the Pacific War had devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate around the island of Guadalcanal. The waters that separated the opposing forces had earned a grisly nickname, Iron Bottom Sound, a cemetery of steel hulls and men. For the United States Navy, holding the airstrip called Henderson Field was paramount. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, supplying their starving troops on the island was an existential necessity. Every night, Japanese destroyers raced down a channel known as the Slot, delivering reinforcements and supplies in daring runs that the Americans called the Tokyo Express. These were not battleships clashing in broad daylight. They were knife fights in the absolute dark, fought with radar, torpedoes, and raw nerve. Among the smallest and most unorthodox tools at the American disposal were the PT boats. They were not impressive on paper. Each was only 80 feet long, built from 2 layers of plywood laminated with resin, a material that broke rather than bent. Their hulls vibrated violently at high speed. Crewmen called them splinter boxes, and their armor was effectively zero. But what the PT boats lacked in protection, they made up for in aggression and blinding speed. Powered by 3 Packer Marine engines, they could reach over 40 knots, throwing a rooster tail of spray that could be seen for miles. They carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes on roll-off racks, and a mix of 20mm cannons and .50 caliber machine guns. Their crews were volunteers, often fishing boat sailors, college athletes, or restless adventurers who found the cramped conditions and constant leaks preferable to the rigid formality of the big ships. On the night of December 11th, 2 of these boats rested at their forward base on Tulagi. PT-37, commanded by Lieutenant Lester Gambrill, a veteran of the Solomons campaign who had already learned that hesitation was death. His executive officer was a young ensign named John F. Kennedy, who would later command PT-109. PT-59 was skippered by Lieutenant Hank Morse, a calm and deliberate officer known for his steady hand in chaos. Their crews, numbering just 14 men each, stuffed their pockets with chocolate bars and ammunition, checked their oxygen-filled torpedoes, and studied the intelligence reports. A large Japanese force was expected to make a resupply run that night. The moon was new, cloaking Iron Bottom Sound in an impenetrable blackness broken only by the pale glow of phosphorescence in the waves. It was exactly the kind of night where small boats could slip in close, undetected by radar and unseen by even the best night optics. Opposite these humble wooden craft stood the finest destroyer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Terazuki. She was a monster, massively advanced for her time. At nearly 440 feet long and displacing over 3,700 tons, she dwarfed the PT boats by a factor of 50. She was armed with 8 127mm dual-purpose guns and a fearsome battery of 39 25mm anti-aircraft cannons. But what made her truly terrifying was her radar. The Terazuki was one of the first Japanese vessels equipped with the advanced Type 22 radar set, capable of detecting surface targets at ranges the Americans considered impossible. She was the designated flagship of the Tokyo Express, the personal vessel of the man they called the most dangerous Japanese commander in the Solomon Islands, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka. Tanaka was not a fanatic. He was a logistician, a tactician who had perfected the art of night supply runs. He understood that the Americans controlled the sky during the day, so he moved only after sunset. He knew the topography of the slot with the intimacy of a fisherman reading a tide table. His standard strategy was to launch floating drums of supplies over the side of his destroyers at high speed, allowing the tide to carry them to shore while his ships retreated into darkness. He had been doing it for months, and the Americans had been unable to stop him. That frustration was about to change. As dusk fell over Tulagi on December 11th, Gambrill and Morse received their orders. They were to patrol the area north of Cape Esperance, intercepting any Tokyo Express force that attempted to slip past. They slipped their moorings, throttled up their engines, and disappeared into the velvet dark. The sea was rough, rolling with 6-foot swells that slapped the plywood hulls like hammers. The men wore life jackets and leaned into the motion, every sense stretched to its limit. The boats carried no lights, no reflections, no sound louder than the rumble of their engines and the hiss of the bow wave. Out there, somewhere in the blackness, the largest destroyer in the Imperial Navy was hunting them. On board the Terazuki, Tanaka stood on his bridge, confident in his radar, his guns, and his night-fighting doctrine. But in that moonless dark, a thin plywood hull, a willing crew, and a few pounds of explosives were about to prove that size was no guarantee of safety. The stage was set, the hunters and the hunted were in the water, and the clock was ticking toward a moment that would shatter the equilibrium of the entire campaign. Midnight on December 11th, 1942. Iron Bottom sound stretched like an oil, slick beneath an absolute absence of light. Lieutenant Lester Gambrill sat hunched at the helm of PT-37, his eyes straining against the void. The wind tore across the open cockpit at 40 knots, whipping salt spray into his face, but he did not blink. Every nerve in his body was a radar dish tuned for the faintest disruption in the darkness. Beside him, barely visible in the glow of the dimmed instruments, his executive officer marked their position on a chart with a grease pencil that left no trace under the red lens flashlight. The gyro compass hummed low. The engines vibrated through the deck plates. The 77 feet of mahogany and plywood felt like a toothpick on the surface of a black sea. To starboard, invisible but present, PT-59 under Lieutenant Hank Morse maintained its own course, staggered slightly behind to avoid collision in the void. The two boats communicated by blinkered infrared signals, invisible to Japanese optics, but just barely readable by their own specialist. The message came in brief flashes, asterisk contact. Bearing 30, range 15,000 yards. Asterisk Gambrill's hand moved to the throttle without hesitation. He throttled back to reduce the roar of the Packard engines, dropping speed to 12 knots, low enough that the wake all but disappeared into the chop. Every 1,000 yards they closed the distance. The risk of detection multiplied exponentially. The Japanese Type 22 radar on the Terazuki was believed to be the finest in the fleet, capable of piercing this pitch darkness with electrons rather than photons. Gambrill knew he had one advantage only: the sea itself. The swells built to near 8 feet that night, churned up by a storm that had passed to the south. Big ships, destroyers, with their high freeboards and stiff hulls, rolled in such conditions, and their radar dishes wobbled along their axis, losing lock for seconds at a time. The PT boats, low and narrow, rode the waves like corks. Their radar signature, even the rudimentary, so radar fitted to PT-37, was a faint blip that the Japanese operators might dismiss as clutter or a ghostly refraction. Gambrill relied on that. He relied also on the terrible geometry of Henderson Field. The Japanese supply run was racing toward Cape Esperance, where the island's dark mass blocked both sky, glow, and radar horizon. By slipping in close to the coast, the PT boats could use the rock and tree line as a shield against detection. They saw the enemy before the enemy saw them. At least, they sensed him. At 3,000 yards, the outline of the Japanese formation resolved not as a solid shape, but as a void within the void. It was a black hole of steel. Gambrill froze and stared. They had been told to expect a standard Tokyo Express, destroyers of the Mitsuki or Fubuki class, around 300 feet each. Instead, the lead ship was a ridge. The Terazuki steamed at the head of 11 destroyers, her bow slicing the water at high speed, her silhouette stretching across the horizon like a cliff sliding silently through the night. Gambrill counted 1, 2, 3 for shapes behind her, then 6, then 11. This was not a supply run. It was a fleet. His heart beat a sharp cadence against his ribs. The Mark 15 torpedoes on their roll-off racks were heavy and clumsy, their gyroscopic mechanisms requiring careful preset angles. Gambrill made the calculation in seconds. The Terazuki was making approximately 32 knots. A standard torpedo run from the front would close the distance too fast, giving the destroyer a chance to turn away. If they could cut across her path, drop the fish perpendicular to her heading, the spread would intersect her course. but that required extremes of timing and stealth. He gave the signal. PT-37 swung hard to port, cutting in an arc that brought her bow parallel to the shoreline. PT-59 followed, mirroring the maneuver a mile behind. The water churned under their hulls, and the men held their breaths. The next 10 minutes passed in a suspended state, each second magnified by the thrumming anticipation. Gambrel crept closer. 2,000 yards. 1,500. The Terazuki's bridge, a blocky structure bristling with antennas and gun directors, now appeared as a distinct square atop the enormous hull. He could see the faint glow of her hot engine vents, the spark of a cigarette from a lookout who should have been disciplined. He could hear, carried across the water, the low thrum of her turbines. At 1,200 yards, Gambrel gave the order. The deckhands pulled the arming lanyards. For Mark 15 torpedoes, each carrying over 400 pounds of explosives, splashed into the sea in quick succession. Their wakes left phosphorescent trails across the dark water, luminous snakes that pointed directly back to the launch point. The Japanese lookouts saw the wakes. A shout rose from the Terazuki's forward gun mount. An alarm klaxon screamed. The big destroyer's rudder bit the water with desperate power, and the massive vessel began to turn. But she was too large, too laden with the mass of a fleet flagship to evade quickly. The fourth torpedo, fired a split second later than the others, found the gap. It struck the Terazuki not in her side, but near her bow, directly beneath the forward magazine. The explosion was not a dull thud. It was a blinding flash, a curtain of fire that tore the night in half. The forward part of the ship seemed to lift out of the water, the entire bow section convulsing upward in a cataclysmic eruption that threw debris hundreds of feet into the air. In that instant, the largest destroyer in the Imperial Japanese Navy became a burning corpse on the Black Sea, a pyre for the sailors who seconds before had believed they were invincible. The fire rose like a vertical sunrise, an eruption of orange and white that turned Iron Bottom Sound into a hellish diorama. For a fraction of a second, every man on every boat in that engagement saw clearly. The Terazuki's forward half lifted at an unnatural angle, her keels snapping as the bulkhead between the forward magazine and the sea gave way with a shriek of tearing metal. The bow separated from the main body, not cleanly, but in a convulsion of twisted plates and exploding ammunition lockers. The sea rushed into the gap, white-hot steam hissing skyward as cold ocean met red-hot steel. The forward section settled quickly, dragging downward by the weight of its own destruction, and by the time the first echoes of the blast reached the shore of Guadalcanal, the Terazuki's bow had already disappeared beneath the surface. But the stern remained afloat for longer, perhaps only 3 or 4 minutes, but in that span, the sounds were enough to haunt a generation of sailors. The screaming of structural metal, the secondary explosions rippling through the aft magazines, and beneath it all, the desperate shouts of men who had no time to reach the boats. The Terazuki carried a complement of around 300 officers and crew, and most of them were in the forward compartments when the torpedo struck. The survivors who escaped through shattered hatches and burning passageways found themselves in a sea churning with flaming oil. The stern settled slowly, listing to port, and then, without ceremony, it rolled over and sank, leaving a broad slick of debris and an orange flame that burned on the water for 20 minutes. Aboard the Terazuki's bridge, Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka had been thrown from his command chair by the concussion. He did not remember the impact, only the sensation of being lifted and slammed sideways. His executive officer found him on the deck, his right leg twisted grotesquely, the bone exposed below the knee, a piece of shrapnel the size of a bayonet lodged deep in the muscle. Tanaka's face was bloodless, but his eyes were sharp, focusing through the pain with the discipline of a career officer who had trained himself to ignore the flesh. He gave one order: signal the escort group to continue the mission. Then he passed out from blood loss. The escort group had no intention of continuing. The 5 destroyers trailing behind the Terazuki had witnessed the annihilation of their flagship in under 60 seconds. Their radar operators screamed warnings of additional contacts. the faint signatures of the PT boats now fleeing at maximum speed. But in the chaos of the burning oil and the blinding glare of the wreckage, the Japanese lookouts saw only confusion. A pair of Japanese destroyers fired star shells, illuminating the area in an eerie white daylight. But PT-37 and PT-59 had already turned hard to the northeast, their throttles slammed to full, the Packard engines roaring at 2,000 horsepower each. The water behind them boiled white. The Japanese gunners opened fire with 127mm rounds that splashed 700 yards off target, the salvos landing harmlessly in the empty sea. The PT boats zigzagged, their hulls slapping the waves, the crews clinging to any handhold, the exhaust fumes choking the cockpit. One shell came closer, straddling PT-37's wake, the geyser drenching Gambrill and his helmsman with hot salt water. But it was not a second volley that ended the chase. It was the sight of the dead flagship. The Japanese destroyers slowed, their commander indecisive, caught between orders to press the attack and the pragmatic horror of losing their admiral. They turned back, forming a defensive ring around the burning slick, lowering boats to search for survivors. The mission was over. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. Back at base on Tulagi, the PT boats arrived before dawn, their crews drenched, exhausted, and shaking with adrenaline. Gambrill kept the details sparse in his initial report, merely stating that his boat had engaged and likely sunk an enemy destroyer. It was not until the intelligence officers examined the wreckage reports and cross-referenced the Japanese naval traffic over the next 72 hours that the full scope of the victory became clear. The ship sunk was not just any destroyer. It was the largest unit of its class in the Imperial Navy. The Terazuki, 440 feet of steel and advanced electronics, now lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese after-action report, intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence at the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, painted a grim picture. The official communiqué noted with clinical brevity the loss of the vessel, the death of the commanding officer, and the severe wounding of Rear Admiral Tanaka. Tanaka was evacuated first to a field hospital on Guadalcanal by seaplane, then to Rabaul aboard a cruiser, his leg too damaged to save. The surgeons amputated it below the knee. His transfer to Tokyo for convalescence was finalized within 2 weeks. The report also admitted, in a rare moment of candor, that the supply mission had been aborted and that the destroyers had returned to base without delivering their cargo. For the Americans reading that report, the implications were clear. The logistic backbone of the Tokyo Express had been broken. A wooden boat, a determined crew, and a single torpedo had removed from the battlefield the one man who made the supply runs work. The campaign for Guadalcanal was about to change in ways no one yet fully grasped. The sinking of the Terazuki was not merely the loss of a single warship, however impressive the vessel had been. It was the removal of a linchpin from a carefully balanced machine of war. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, master of the Tokyo Express, lay on a hospital cot in Rabaul, his right leg gone below the knee, his body racked by infection and exhaustion. The doctors who treated him noted that he did not complain. Instead, he asked repeatedly for reports from Guadalcanal, for the status of the supply runs, for the name of the American commander who had done this to him. But no matter how many reports arrived, the answer was the same. The runs had become chaotic, disorganized, and bloodier by the week. The Japanese chain of command could not replace Tanaka quickly. His successor, Rear Admiral Tamiji Kiyanagi, was a capable officer but lacked the intimate knowledge of the slot, the treacherous currents, and the American patrol patterns that Tanaka had developed over months of trial and error. Koyanagi was a textbook commander. Tanaka had been a creature of the water. The difference became apparent within the first week of Tanaka's evacuation. On December 14th, 3 nights after the sinking, a destroyer group attempted a supply run under Koyanagi's direction. The formation sailed at standard speed, 30 knots, with minimal evasive maneuvers. American PT boats and radar-equipped destroyers intercepted them north of Cape Esperance, forcing the Japanese to jettison their supply drums early, many of which drifted out to sea rather than toward the beach. The soldiers on Guadalcanal received nothing. By Christmas week, the situation for the Japanese garrison had degraded sharply. Tanaka's system called for the drums to be released at precise coordinates, timed to match the incoming tide, the darkness of the moon, and the intervals of American aircraft patrols. Without his leadership, the destroyer captains reverted to standard doctrine, racing in at high speed, dropping drums wherever appeared safe, and retreating before the Americans arrived. The result was a haphazard scatter of drifting supplies that the Imperial soldiers on the island could rarely recover. Starvation began to weaken the garrison. The official reports from the 17th Army staff, dictated from a command post buried in the Guadalcanal jungle, noted that daily caloric intake had dropped below 800 calories per man by late December. Tanaka's absence had turned a sustainable supply line into a desperate gamble. Historical analysis of the campaign, compiled by naval historians at the Naval War College in subsequent decades, drew a direct line from the sinking of the Terazuki to the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. The Japanese High Command, meeting in Tokyo in early January 1943, faced a grim calculus. Without Tanaka's logistical genius, the Tokyo Express had become a meat grinder, losing destroyers at an unsustainable rate. The loss of the Terazuki itself was a blow, but the greater wound was the removal of the man who had held the entire resupply effort together. The official record from the Imperial General Headquarters, declassified in the 1970s, noted that Tanaka's departure was described as a decisive factor in the collapse of the defensive perimeter. One historian later stated that Tanaka was the most efficient and dangerous Japanese commander in the Solomons, and his absence was worth more than a fleet of new ships. The numbers supported that assessment. During Tanaka's tenure, from August to December 1942, the Tokyo Express delivered an estimated 17,000 tons of supplies to Guadalcanal with a loss of only 3 destroyers. In the 3 months following his evacuation, that delivery rate fell by more than half, while the loss rate quadrupled. The destroyer losses mounted. The Ayanami, the Makinami, the Sazanami, the Akatsuki, each one sunk or damaged in supply runs that Tanaka might have directed with more caution or more aggression, depending on the conditions. The Japanese Navy had not planned for a war of attrition in the slot. They had assumed that decisive battles would determine the outcome. But Tanaka had understood that the war in the Solomons was not about battles. It was about supplies. And without him, the Imperial Navy lost its grip on that fundamental truth. The withdrawal began in February 1943, a bitter retreat codenamed Operation Ko. Japanese destroyers snuck back into Iron Bottom Sound under the cover of thick weather to evacuate the starving garrison of Guadalcanal. It was an operation that Tanaka had proposed months earlier, but his recommendation had been dismissed as defeatist. Now, with the garrison reduced to skeletons and the supply lines severed, the evacuation was the only rational choice. The destroyers pulled nearly 11,000 soldiers off the island, an irony that was not lost on the man who had once commanded them. They were now using the same ships, the same route, the same tactics that Tanaka had perfected, but for a retreat instead of a resupply. The broader strategic implications extended beyond Guadalcanal. The loss of the campaign shattered Japanese morale across the Solomons. The confidence that had sustained the Imperial Navy through the first year of the war evaporated. For the United States, the victory at Guadalcanal was the first major land offensive, the first time the Japanese had been pushed back on a permanent basis. And at the heart of that victory, buried in the operational reports and the war diaries, lay the moment when a 77-foot plywood boat fired 4 torpedoes into the darkness and struck the largest destroyer in the Imperial fleet. The sinking of the Terazuki did not end the war, but it removed the one man who could have delayed the American advance, shifted the momentum of the Pacific campaign, and demonstrated that the smallest vessels, in the right hands, could alter the fate of empires. The Terazuki rests today on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound, her hull broken, her gun silent, her radar arrays corroded and silent. She is surrounded by the wreckage of dozens of other ships, a sprawling underwater cemetery that marks the graveyard of Japan's South Pacific ambitions. But those who study the history of naval warfare know that the shadow of that burning flagship stretches far beyond her own steel, reaching across the months that followed, influencing the decisions of generals and admirals who never saw her burn. A single torpedo, a single wound, a single moment of darkness and courage, and the empire that had seemed invincible began to crumble.